Hello, welcome to this lecture on leisure and media. This is actually going to be less about leisure and more about media. This is my particular area of expertise, specifically the sociological study of video games and interaction in other online and digital spaces. So I'm really going to enjoy this lecture. If you think about recreation and leisure, you think about yourself. What are your recreation and leisure activities? What do you like to do in your spare time? What do you like to do when you are free? It's always interesting to hear how many students name things related to either consumption or media in terms of like what you like to do in your free time. Pre-pandemic, people would oftentimes say something like shopping or partying or some sort of socializing. Usually that socializing happens in settings where you are buying things, right? You're going out to eat, you're consuming food, so your hobby revolves around socializing and food. Or your hobby revolves around socializing and going to concerts or going to festivals or whatever it is. Most people will say something related to consumption or media, like, what do you like to do in your free time? I like to listen to music. I like to play video games. So think about also other unusual or kind of atypical or unique hobbies that you might have, such as the people that I know all participate in some of these things, like creating doll houses, or investing in cryptocurrency as a hobby, or building fursuits, or you can think about fandoms and other subcultures as hobbies. Homesteading, right? My brother and his fiance are homesteaders up in New Hampshire, so that's quite an interesting hobby. A lot of students, if I ask them this, they will claim that they don't have free time, they don't have hobbies. But I know that everybody can at least think about movies that you watch, TV, music. Like almost everyone participates in this stuff these days. But when you say that you don't have free time, you don't have hobbies, so when we come back from a weekend and I say, how was your weekend? And students oftentimes say, I didn't do anything. I say, what did you do? They say, I didn't do anything. I say, really? You didn't do anything? They say, no, I worked. Like, all weekend? Sometimes, yeah. But usually there's some TV watching or some music listening or some engagement with something fun or something hobby related, even if you did spend most of your time working. But this really illustrates the need that we have to delineate between sort of like work and hobbies, like work on the one hand, hobbies on the other hand. And speaks to the modern sort of phenomenon and focus on work-life balance and self-care and all that sort of stuff. So these are some that I can point out to you as examples. If you've been watching enough of these things or coming to class, you know some of my hobbies. You know that I'm a really huge heavy metal fan. That, well, pre-COVID days, going to concerts was a big thing for me that I've done since I was a teenager. That listening to metal music is like a pastime of mine. I really like this. You've probably also heard me talk about video games. I really like to play video games. So the one on the left, you can think about this sort of stuff, right? Think about your hobbies. What is your hobby free? Right? How is your hobby related to consumption, even if it's a media hobby? So video games, for example. How do you play video games? Well, usually you have to buy the video game. There are free games, but usually you buy the game, you invest in the game. Sometimes it can be a longer term thing if you invest in like a subscription-based game, or if you use microtransactions or something like that. It can be quite it can eat up a lot of money over time and be quite an investment. Do you get some sort of tangible result from your hobby? Can you think about the status of your hobby, right? So, well, to explain the video game one a little bit, the one on that image on the top left, is a character from Aqua Teen Hunger Force, which you may know that show as an old Adult Swim show. I don't even know if it's still on, but I used to be obsessed with it when I was younger. Anyway, this is a character named Carl, and the image below Carl, I made a character in a video game called Dream Daddy, which is like a dad dating simulator. It's a fantastic game, but it's very niche. Anyway, I figured I could make a character that looked just like Carl, which I thought was pretty great. And sometimes he says things that sound just like something that Carl from Aqua Teen Hunger Force would say. Anyway, my particular hobbies, right? Um, Gaming is a mediated hobby. This particular game is a single player game, but people play games. You play games with people all the time. So video games mediate the relationships between people. Um, Gaming used to be much more of a stigmatized hobby that is on the like status scale of where hobbies rank. This was something that nerds and geeks tended to do. This is way less the case today. But when I was growing up, and maybe when you were growing up too, but definitely when I was growing up, it was not cool to play video games, at least to be like really into video games. And then certain genres, of course, are stigmatized more than others. So if you're playing like fantasy or role-playing games, this is seen as less cool than if you were playing like sports games or like a first-person shooter game. So think about how your hobbies might be organized in like a hierarchy of status. The one on the upper right, when I was a kid, I used to collect baseball cards. I loved baseball cards. I was obsessed with baseball. I was really into all sorts of sports, but I really, really, really liked baseball. So when I was a kid, my main hobby probably, besides like playing soccer, was definitely collecting baseball cards. And that was like a part of myself, right? Whenever I got money, I would ride my bike to the baseball card shop, which was across the street from my neighborhood. Um, and I would just spend it on baseball cards. So like, I'd get $1 for cutting the grass, and I would take it straight to the baseball card shop and buy cards. Now, unfortunately, those cards today are all worthless because there's a huge baseball card boom. Like the hobby exploded in the 1980s and 1990s, right around the time I was at the height of my collecting. And so there were just millions and millions and millions of cards printed. And so the value of all those cards, because so many were printed, the value just went to the floor. There's so many of these cards. I've been trying to sell these recently. My entire baseball card collection, I haven't gotten an offer higher than $300. I'm really trying to get a little bit more money for that stuff. So maybe if I hang on to them, they'll increase in value. But anyway, obviously there's money involved in this hobby, right? And it's mediated to some extent as well. It's a piece of paper media. And it's something tangible, right? Like through this hobby, I created a collection and I organized it and I used to spend time doing it. And when I was a kid, I learned how to use Microsoft Excel and Quicken, which is like tax software, like for creating spreadsheets. I learned how to use this software when I was a kid to organize baseball cards and became quite an expert on this, and actually used to give my dad worked at a bank. I used to give his employees lessons when I was like 8 on how to use Quicken software. So another maybe stigmatized hobby, but a lot of people collected baseball cards back then. And then the one on the bottom right is me standing on a rock on a hill overlooking a town in northeastern Spain. So another one of my hobbies is hiking. I love to hike, like backpacking, camping. Just being outside and in the woods is one of my favorite things to do. This was from about a year and a half ago. It's like 2 summers ago, not last summer, but the summer before. I hiked El Camino del Norte, which is the Northern Way. It's a old pilgrimage trail that runs across northern Spain. It's about 500 miles long. We actually started in northeastern France and walked all the way to the name of this place escapes me, but it's an old cathedral in western Spain where the pilgrimage route ends. You can continue and walk into Portugal. There's another one of these caminos are sort of across in different places in Spain. There's a camino in England. My brother and his fiance actually finished up. They did one in northern Portugal, I think, after we finished our Spanish walk. But anyway, it's a cheap trip once you get out there, but you got to have money to be able to stay in places and eat food, and you got to have all the gear, right? You got to have this expensive backpack to be able to go on these long hikes. These days, it can be quite expensive. People spend, and I did not spend this much, but people will spend thousands and thousands of dollars to prepare to engage in this hobby, right? And when I'm going out for just a regular weekend or something, like it's real cheap. I've got all my stuff. I just need to secure a campground, usually paying, $8 a night somewhere in a state park, or going somewhere for free if I can, find some place for free that I can camp. Going hiking is usually free. There's like a parking fee oftentimes, but like thinking about how hobbies have become institutionalized is pretty interesting as well. Um, Hiking, for example, like why can't you just like go walk through the woods? Well, most woods that you go walk through are protected in some way or are owned by someone, whether it's the government or privately, and you usually need to pay to use it, which is weird to think about paying to use nature, but such it is. So these are just some examples of stuff to think about. I'm going to switch now that I've kind of like rambled about hobbies that am or have been interested in, and turn to a larger discussion of media. So here's some cat hair in my mouth. Gross. Here's an outline for the rest of this talk. Now I want you to do something for me. I know this is a lecture, and you're supposed to pay attention to me, but I'm going to tell you to do the opposite of that a little bit. Pay attention to your phone as well, and you may be on your computer, so pay attention to your email and other notifications. Whatever device is giving you notifications, I want you to get out a sheet of paper while you're watching this lecture, or open a document and tally every time you get a notification, or if you can save all your notifications up and tally at the end. So like you'll probably have a category for texts, for emails, for social media notifications like Snapchat or TikTok notifications or whatever, software updates, Amazon shopping updates or whatever it is. Keep a tally for each of these things that you have notifications for, and then email me your tally at the end of class, at the end of the lecture, okay? And I'm going to add it to a data set that I started collecting on this last year. So, as we have talked about, remember the Google as an agent of socialization activity. You can think about a lot of this lecture in terms of that activity. Media is a social institution, and it has become the dominant social institution today, right? The dominant agent of socialization, I argue. One way to see this is to imagine your life without media. Can you imagine your life without media? Probably not, right? Everything is media. Media is everywhere. I've got media here in this device. I am like doing a PowerPoint on a piece of technology, and this PowerPoint will become a medium through which you get information. I've got a bunch of hardware, right? Like this mouse and the microphone and the webcam. There's a TV over there and an Xbox controller and an old broken computer tower. Right? There's technology and media everywhere. So you can check out these statistics and just think about the ubiquity of media in everyday life these days. But how does media affect your life? What forms of media are you the most reliant on for entertainment, information, education? How would your life be different without mass media forms? Are there any that you use that you could live without? Like, could you turn off your social media accounts? Could you get rid of them? What would your life be like if that happened? How would you be educated without media? How would you be entertained without media? How would you get knowledge about the world without media? I mean, there was a time when, this was the case. Like really, before the printing press, there was like no media besides either like oral communication or handwritten things that could be like copied, but before anything could be printed, there was no way to like spread information around except like by mouth. And society functioned, right? There was a society, so it was primitive compared to our standards, but society can operate without media. But we have become utterly penetrated by media, right? Utterly dependent, media shapes everything. As you can see all these statistics down here, right? Those are interesting ones. Yeah, your TV viewing increases with age. A lot of people don't know that. The older you get, the older you are, the more TV you tend to watch. A lot of the reason for this is because older people grew up more with TV and with less other forms, and so they continue to watch TV. Right, almost everyone has a cell phone. Most people have smartphones. But look at the rise of this, right? From less than 10 years ago, smartphone ownership has gone up from 35% in the United States to 81%. Right? That's a huge increase. I got my first smartphone in maybe like 2012 or 2013 or something. Most people have broadband, but not everyone does, right? We tend to assume that like everyone is connected to the internet, but this is not the case, right? There are many people who are not connected to the internet, who don't have reliable internet connections. This is called the digital divide, and is largely a function of social class. Um, and this has really been important when education has moved virtual to virtual platforms during the pandemic, right? We assume that everybody has internet at home, but this is absolutely not the case. And you can probably tell which of your professors are more sort of like in tune with understanding the digital divide and which are not. Like which of your professors just assume that you all have utterly reliable internet connections all the time, and you can do work and you can produce, the exact kinds of like, videos, like whatever your professors want. And then other professors that like let you do things in multiple ways and like want you to let them know if you're having internet trouble or if you don't have a computer at home, like can I get a laptop for you, and all this sorts of stuff. It's really interesting to think about because I've seen it from the faculty and on both sides. And then the last thing I'll point out is how video game playing has increased over in recent years. Youth, right, young people spend about 7 hours per week playing video games on average. And this ranges right from a really kind of lower number to really high, right? There's plenty of people who spend 20, 30, 40 hours a week playing video games, and sometimes I wish I was one of those people that I could just turn everything off and just play a video game and not worry about work. I can do that in the summer a little bit, so I'm looking forward to maybe like a week of doing nothing except playing a long role-playing game. So we are very thoroughly socialized by media, right? Remember, socialization is this process where we learn and internalize the values, beliefs, and norms of our culture, and in so doing, develop a sense of self and the ability to participate effectively in social groups. So if we are thoroughly socialized, through media or through any agent of socialization, then we tend not to think about whatever it is very much, right? It becomes normal. It becomes taken for granted. It becomes internalized. If media consumption, watching TV, playing video games, listening to music, if media consumption becomes normal and unquestioned, which it is, then we are particularly susceptible to a couple of the implications of the theoretical perspectives that are mentioned in your textbook related to media and leisure. So reinforcement theory, for example. Reinforcement theory says that we tend to seek out media programming or media forms that reinforce our pre-existing attitudes and beliefs. So we tend not to question our viewing habits, like why we watch certain TV shows or why we watch certain news channels. I just watched an episode of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia last night, where the characters were watching one of those old, like some parody of an old British drama show. Like I don't know these shows. Like I don't know. I'm making shows up. I think The Crown, that exists, right? Downton Abbey, like these sort of like old like these shows that take place like back in time or something, assuming I'm even right about them, but this is how I think about them. Anyway, the characters in It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia were watching one of these shows, and they were just like, wow, I love this show. I didn't even know I would like this show. I didn't even know I would like this kind of thing. And they're talking about like why they like it. And one of the characters says, oh, we didn't even have to think about why we like it. Because Netflix or whatever streaming service knows that we will like this. And the other character said, how do you know? And says, well, the algorithm, right? The algorithm thinks for you. The computer thinks for you. It knows what you like, and it just gives it to you. And then, of course, you like it because the algorithm says that it's what you like. Think about the way that Netflix and Hulu and all the rest suggest content for you, right? YouTube does this. TikTok does this, right? All of these apps and services suggest content for you based on what they learn about your tastes. And they're pretty good at it, right? I mean, it's not 100%, of course. They show you stuff that sucks all the time, but they get it, they get it pretty good, and they can be pretty certain that you're gonna like what they show them. And to the extent that you become used to this, you're less likely to sort of like question or critically consume what they are suggesting that you watch, right? Because you are likely to say, oh yeah, it's like another crime drama or whatever it is. Another sort of implication of a theoretical perspective that we become susceptible to the extent that socialization through media is quite thorough, is agenda setting theory. Agenda setting theory is the idea that media producers and owners, especially of news, but of other things as well, of other genres, are able to shape the public perception by deciding what is included in media and what is omitted from media. We'll get into examples of this later, but we tend not to question the patterns that we see in our media consumption, or rather the patterns that we don't see, right? Those patterns tend to not be seen. We tend not to question or think about who is producing our media, why they are producing it, or for what purposes. We don't recognize what is excluded, and we don't recognize how media frames our understanding of reality. Think about the realizations that you had when you did the Google as an agent of socialization activity, right? A lot of you wrote that you sort of like, oh my gosh, like Google really does shape our perceptions of marriage and the family. An example of this in terms of agenda setting is if you think about the like two political ideological categories, liberal and conservative, which different news channels, programs, and newscasters fall under each category? You can probably make a list of both. Which news sources do you use and why? In answering that, if you really think about it and answer it, you probably are illustrating reinforcement theory right there, right? By studying news programs and newscasters, you also get good evidence of agenda setting theory. In terms of reinforcement theory, right, you tend to seek out news that confirms your pre-existing values, attitudes, and beliefs. This is really, really well illustrated with a tool that unfortunately was discontinued, but it's called Red Feed, Blue Feed, and you can go look at the archive. If you're on the, you can just Google this, Red Feed, Blue Feed, or click on it if you have the PowerPoint open. But this is a tool that pulls kind of typical content from a liberal Facebook feed, a liberal user's Facebook feed, and a conservative user's Facebook feed, like typical content that you would see, and shows you by issue. So I'm showing you immigration here as the issue, and shows you by issue the feeds side by side, right? The red feed, the conservative feed, and the blue feed, the liberal feed. And you can see just how different the perspectives on different issues are. And therefore, you can see how differently a Facebook feed can shape the reality of the users, can shape their perceptions or their opinions on issues. This is utterly fascinating. Go look at Red Feed, Blue Feed, and play around with it. I wish it was still in operation, but here you can see differences in terms of how each side frames immigrants, framed former President Trump on his handling of immigration issues. This is really interesting stuff. But the point here is that our understandings of politics and political issues are filtered through mass media. Social media, news, influencers, whatever it is. Most of our political knowledge is based on mass media. We participate in politics through media, kind of by liking or upvoting, downvoting things, commenting, having political discussions on social media. And the last point here, media can create moral panics, which means that to the extent that we think about agenda setting theory, right, that media organizations, producers, can sort of select what people see and then select what people don't see. They can filter things in and out. That if there is a particular issue that someone who owns a media company wants to focus on, for example, they can do that. And sometimes this creates moral panics among the population. That is, people decide to focus on, people wind up focusing on some particular problem that seems really scary. Whether it is or isn't, that's how it's being framed by some media. At this point, I do want to make a quick aside that when you talk about media, people talk about media as if it is a thing, right? As if it's like one big giant thing. It is not. People always say like the media, the media. Don't think about media like that. Media are different. There are many, many, many forms and types of media. There's no such thing as the media unless you're talking about it just as a like a social fact, like an institution or something. But there are different media channels. So when you say the media, right, are you talking about Fox News? Or are you talking about CNN? Or are you talking about some other independent news site? Are you talking about social media? Are you talking about Facebook? Are you talking about such and such influencer on Twitter? Like, what are you talking about? You have to clarify what kind of media you're talking about. There's no such thing as the media. There's nothing that the media does. So I encourage you to like be specific when you talk about media. Like, which media are you referring to? Are you talking about liberal media or conservative media or whatever it is? So a lot of news is relatively neutral, and a lot of news is not relatively neutral, and some news is just extremely biased on one way or the other. But they're usually not going to tell you that, right? Even biased news organizations and biased news channels will oftentimes claim objectivity. This works for their audience, who then think that they're getting objective news, and then people on the other side easily critique it as not being objective, and then usually the same thing happens with those people's news. They think it's objective, and then people on the other side can critique it as being biased. It's really interesting. Think about objectivity in news. But without the scientific study of news, you are unaware of exactly the way that news outlets set agendas. You are unaware of the way that they frame topics, the way that they include some topics and exclude others, and therefore the way that they shape your reality. Critically examine the news that you watch. Example: the more local TV news you watch, the more likely you are to say that crime is a problem in your community, the more afraid you will be of crime in your community, that you will be the victim of a violent crime especially, and the less trustful you are of people in your community, right? Local news of any ideological slant, whether it's left-leaning or right-leaning, shows tons of crime stories, right? Local news is like half crime stories. Watch the local news and tell me that I'm wrong. Think about this in terms of agenda setting, right? These programs, the people who write these programs, they select what to show you and they select what not to show you, right? They show you a lot of crime stories for whatever reason. I don't exactly know the reason, but this is something maybe you can look into. Well, one reason is because crime sells, because what do they say? If it bleeds, it leads, right? So if you show like violent and really like shocking stuff, people are more likely to watch it, and that's how local news makes money. People tune in and watch. So that's my answer. But you know, there may be other reasons why they show a lot of crime stuff. But if they show a lot of crime stuff, right, this shapes people's attitudes on crime. It affects how people vote, right? If people are watching a bunch of local news TV and crime is a serious issue for them because they're being shown it constantly on TV, then they're more likely to vote, right? Support candidates who are tough on crime, right? Who think about crime, who think about punishing crime instead of like you know, helping criminals through social programs or something like that. And think about this in terms of reinforcement theory. If you think that crime is bad, I mean, everybody thinks crime is bad, but I mean, if you think that crime is like bad in your area, like especially bad in your area, which you are more likely to do if you watch a lot of local news, then you are more likely to be drawn to these programs in the first place that reinforce your existing viewpoint. You've all heard the term echo chamber. This is kind of an example of echo chambers in TV viewing, but this happens on social media. The red feed, blue feed here is an example of echo chambers. Probably most of your news feeds or your social media feeds are leaning one way or the other, right? It's unlikely that you have like a 50-50 mix, right? Most people are really extreme on one end or the other in terms of what they see in their news feeds. Now, that example of politics demonstrates that media are bound up with the process of social relations. That is, media are bound up with how we learn about the world and interact with one another. Media mediate interaction, which means that interaction is connected through or modified through or facilitated through or shaped through media, right? We don't just interact. I mean, we do face-to-face, but largely we interact through some media form. And this is how we learn about the world these days, more so than direct experience, especially to learn about things far away. And we have more ability to learn about things far away because we're able to learn about them through media, right? We're allowed information information about other places and peoples and cultures is mediated more than ever before. But you can think about how, there's this idea called the electronic hearth, that media technologies bring us together. Think about the family. So this picture I've got of this guy and his kid here. Looks like the kid's on a phone and they're having some sort of fun, right? They're having some sort of bonding moment, right? They're like physically connecting and they're smiling around the electronic hearth. The hearth is like a fireplace, is a hearth. If you think about the hearth, it's a fireplace, and the family traditionally would gather around the fireplace and they would bond and tell stories and talk and read books and have a lot of family life, bonding, connecting family life, social relationships around the hearth. It was the center of the home. Now, tablets and video games and TVs are like electronic hearths. And I just mentioned it in terms of bringing the family together. You can also think about the dividing functions of the hearth as well, right? We can all, families that are like this, and likely you've done this with your family as well, where you're all sitting in the same room, maybe even around an actual hearth, around a fireplace, but each of you on your own tablets interacting with other people who are not physically present. So media become fully integrated in our media lives, thanks to convergence, which is a phenomenon whereby the boundaries between consumer and producer become blurred, and the boundaries between human and machine become blurred. The first, consumer and producer, think simply about TikTok or YouTube, right? You can create content and upload it, and other people can see it. You are not only a consumer of content on these sites, you are also a producer. Most of us are producers in some way. Even when you comment, right? You're producing. You're adding to the conversation. You're, adding a perspective. You're linking to something else, whatever it is. And this is relatively new, right? It's only with the advent of social media that everyone can be a producer. And this is quite unique and really affects how we theorize media and media life. With human and machine, think about, I used this example before, but I've got my Fitbit on, right? My old Fitbit, it's not I can't touch it and swipe it or anything like that. Actually, oh my God, I can. No, sort of. It's more like a tap, right? You can't swipe, you can tap. I knew you could tap. But I have on my body, right, my heartbeat, how far I'm walking, all various physical measurements about me. And this piece of technology blurs the line between me and technology, or me and a machine. And the same sort of thing, right? I can record this PowerPoint, and my thoughts, my image, my gestures are externalized, right? And housed on the internet for other people to then go and interact with, to see, to download. When you get really deep into this, you get to, think about those various technophiles and futurists who work on the idea of uploading one's consciousness to the cloud. And this is very interesting to me. The idea of doing this, of trying to recreate one's personality through artificial intelligence. There are lots of chatbots that can sort of do this these days. Some of the more interesting ones, I think, are the ones that you can get that try to recreate the personality of a dead person so that you can continue communicating with them after they're dead, right? It takes all their social media accounts and just looks through their social media accounts and tries to build sort of a profile of how they talk and things like this. There's a Black Mirror episode about this, but as with a lot of things in Black Mirror, the technology either already existed in some sort of nascent state or was developed after the Black Mirror episode. And that is one example. The Black Mirror episode takes it way farther and actually puts the AI inside an actual body that then can come back and you can physically interact with it. But there are these programs that you can Google and find, and you sort of like upload your consciousness in a weird sort of way. It's it's not complete, but it's interesting. But it's this right. It's an example of convergence, and you can think very easily about how this might continue in the future. But convergence makes it difficult to see media and media use as separate from ourselves, as outside our lived experience. We completely internalize this mode of being human, right? Being human involves being technological as well. So my quote here from Dewey's, I don't know how to say his name. This mediation of everything is premised on the increasing invisibility of media, which in turn makes media indivisible from all aspects of everyday life. The moment that media become invisible, our sense of identity and indeed our experience of reality itself becomes irreversibly modified because it is mediated. So notice my picture of the baby, my picture of the family. Actually, I'm not sure what picture I put down there. But if our lives are completely mediated, and think about how this is sped up during the pandemic as we've been forced to have even more mediated lives than in the past. Education, for example, largely moving online, and so on. The more normal this is, the more invisible the influence of media becomes. And so our experience of reality becomes modified, right? Becomes even more fully and concretely modified. And this author argues it's irreversibly so. And I wouldn't quite argue irreversibly because you can think about it being differently, but you definitely, to think about reversing this, you have to fight against power, right? You have to fight against dominant social norms. Many of you have probably seen the movie The Truman Show. It's a great movie for thinking about the topic of this lecture. I encourage you to go watch it. It's an older Jim Carrey movie from like the mid-90s. But there's actually a term called the Truman Show delusion. And this term means that a person believes that their life is a staged reality show, that they're constantly being watched by cameras. You might connect this to like a sense of paranoia or something like this. You feel that you're always being watched. The Truman Show delusion says that we are all sort of living inside our very own Truman Show. And I guess I should explain what this is about, what the show is about, or the movie is about, if you've never seen it. In the movie, Jim Carrey lives his life without knowing that he is the star of the world's most popular reality show that's watched by millions and millions of people around the world. Eventually, he realizes, because people are acting weird, and he starts noticing stuff, and he sort of eventually realizes that, there's something going on here. There's something weird about my reality. Like, nobody else seems to notice it but me. And so he eventually realizes that something's going on. And he's trying to figure out like who's fake and who's real and who's acting. And the point here is that our lived reality cannot be experienced separate from or outside from media. So the Truman Show delusion is this idea that, in a sense, we are the stars of our very own reality show, that everyone around us is just an actor, and we have to figure out also, who's fake and who's real. And when you think about this online, it's really easy to apply this idea, the concept of the Truman Show delusion. But in our life today, think about it. This is more real than fiction, right? You perform on social media all the time. Like, you perform different roles, you're on different sites at different times. You have in some sites you have like a more fake identity. You might make something up. On other sites, you have a more authentic identity. You can think about Rensta and Insta. What is it? Fensta and Rensta, the fake Instagram and the real Instagram stuff. But we are actually being watched more and more. I'll show you on the next slide. But how does the Truman Show end? Right? I won't spoil it for you, but if you watch it and if you know what I'm talking about, how does the Truman Show end? Right? Can he escape? Media is total. Media is reality. Right? We are being watched all the time. Right? It's not a delusion. It's not a delusion. There are hundreds of cameras on GDC campus, for example. Hundreds. But I think the number last time I figured was like 500 cameras on GDC campus. And you rarely see it. You don't think about it. You're being watched on street corners. You're being watched all the time. You're being monitored on the internet. It's not a delusion. But the content of delusions are invariably tied to a person's life experience, the content of the specifics of the delusion. And contemporary culture does play an important role. There was a study conducted in 2008 that showed how delusional content has evolved over time from initially religious and magical, so people thought about demons and devils and people being, cursing them and stuff like this, to political. And think about the middle of the last century and the Red Scare and all this stuff. People had political delusions. The government was coming for them. The government was watching them. People still have these. People still have both kinds. But eventually, delusions these days are more technologically themed than ever. People are watching you through your computer, right? Put the little tape on your webcam. People are watching you through your computer. People are watching you with technology. People are monitoring you, right? The COVID vaccine injects like trackers into you. Like these sorts of conspiracy theories are everywhere. And this is the form of modern delusions that relate to surveillance. But like I said, you are surveilled. Think about face tracking technology that's developing, especially in China. Think about the social credit system in China. I don't know that I've talked to you all about that this semester, but if you're unfamiliar with the social credit score in China, go look that up. Something like that, it's really dystopian, but it is coming more and more to the United States and other countries as well. On D2L, right, your professors actually monitor you. I know who watches. If I don't look, but I could find out who watches my videos and who doesn't. I know obviously, how much time you spend on quizzes. I can correlate, and there's a pretty clear correlation, like how long people spend on quizzes versus how good grades they get on quizzes. I have all this data, right, that I have access to, that students are generally unaware that professors might have or might look at if they do have. So this delusion, right, the Truman Show delusion, the idea that we are surveilled, clearly represents how agents of socialization also serve as agents of social control. Targeted advertising is a great point, a great example to look at this. How agents of socialization also serve as agents of social control. So think about the last time you were the target of targeted advertising. The hope is that you are completely unaware of this, right? Advertising companies don't want you to know that you're being the target of targeted advertising, but it pops through, and you're aware of it a lot. Like, who knows what I'm talking about right now in this lecture, that when I log into Facebook the next time, it's going to show me an advertisement for baseball cards or, whatever it is. That happens all the time, and that's when we sort of see the crack in the facade that we are being monitored, we are being surveilled, and we are being advertised to as a result of it. But now, nearly every time you see an ad, especially on a device that has some sort of history or browsing history, you should think about this in terms of surveillance. But we have these fears about surveillance sometimes. So sometimes we don't think about it and it's fine, and other times we're really afraid of being surveilled. And it's really interesting to think about why people tend to be afraid of some kind of surveillance but not others. So for example, those end user license agreements, when you agree to use an app like Facebook, or you agree to play a video game online, you never read those, right? It's like legalese and it's really long and you just click through. And you are very literally giving your rights away and selling and agreeing to have your information sold a lot of the time by clicking through these. But you'd rather use Facebook. It's like the price that we pay to participate, to have our society, to have our existence more fully mediated, right? We give up part of ourselves so that we have access to entertainment or information or whatever the benefits that we perceive. But more recently, I remember, that, and people are still like really kind of, you can find pockets of people who are really up in arms about this, about TikTok, right? And like the fears that people have about TikTok being associated with the Chinese government, that TikTok is a Chinese-owned social media brand, a Chinese-owned social media product, and people are really concerned about the Chinese having your information, right? And you remember back when Donald Trump took a really big interest in this and was talking about like banning TikTok unless the company would sell it, or at least partly sell it to American companies. So other American companies, invested or like partially own or something. You look up the specifics of it, but now partially own or invest in TikTok, and those companies are Oracle, which what is Oracle? It's not Flash. Do they own Flash or Adobe? Oracle is like a huge like web development like corporation that does a lot of the like powering behind how the internet works. Walmart was another huge one, and Microsoft and Bill Gates were other huge ones, right? So people are like not okay with the fact that a Chinese company might have some information about, and this information is like demographic stuff, and it's stuff they'll use to advertise to you. But they're totally okay with Walmart or Microsoft or Oracle having all of your information because they're going to do the same thing. People like don't recognize that what the difference is between a Chinese company having your information and an American company. And to be clear, all these companies are global, are multinational companies. They're transnational, right? They are not particularly invested in one particular country or another. So yeah, I think that was just a super interesting example of the fears that we have of surveillance being very selectively applied. But like, you can answer the question, like, why afraid of China? Well, because news media, especially conservative news media, frames China as like a really, really, really bad, like the bad guy. Liberal media does as well, but not as much. It's super interesting. So you can think about other examples like that as well. Now, you occasionally hear arguments against media life, like you can just turn it off, like ways to escape, like ways that, like, how could Truman have escaped in the Truman Show? How could he have escaped his media life? Can he physically leave? It's a fair question. Can you leave? Can you stop? Can you just shut it down and turn it off? You can think about arguments akin to Plato's allegory of the cave. I'm sure that many of you have come across Plato's allegory of the cave before. This is, to paint the picture sort of here, but the idea is that there are a bunch of people and they are chained to a wall, and they're in a cave. They're chained to a wall, and they're looking at the back of the cave wall. And on the cave wall, they see shadows. They see images dancing on the cave wall. And that is their reality, right? They're chained there, and that's what they see is these images dancing on the cave wall. They think that is real. But what they don't see, they're unable to turn around, or they can't turn around, or they don't know to turn around. What they don't see is behind them there's a light source, a fire. And there are actual people back there, and they're like dancing and doing stuff in front of the fire, and they're creating those images. And so there is some sort of reality out of the perception of the people in the cave that's more real than what they're seeing, that's more accurate a representation of what they're seeing. And what they also don't recognize is that if they could get out of their chains and they could turn around and see what was causing the images, they would have a better understanding of things. But then they could also leave the cave, right? But if they leave the cave, they run the risk of having their entire reality upended and essentially like just, I can't handle it. they leave the cave after they've been in the cave, right? It's sunny, it's bright, you can't see anything, it's uncomfortable, like they don't want to be there, they're gonna get sunburned or whatever. So they're really comfortable just sitting in their cave, like not knowing anything else. Um, so it's sort of like, to talk about the allegory of the cave and the arguments against media life, the arguments sort of like to get out of the cave. We sort of have to assume, we act as if sometimes we act as if there is no real world separate from the one we are embedded in, right? If we are thoroughly socialized in what we know about reality from media, then to any practical extent, there is no real world separate from our mediated reality. But we know that there is, right? We know there's nature out there, and there's like other places and countries out there, and you can actually go to the place that you see on TV. It's an increasingly difficult position to maintain that we can't disconnect, because the more you look into it, the more you realize, like the more you can understand how power operates, like how agenda setting operates, how producers operate to sort of create the mediated images and the mediated reality that we see through what we consume. Have you ever tried to disconnect? And I encourage you to play with this and see what happens. Like, really disconnect from social media for a day, a week, a month. See what happens. I had a student one time who did this for a class project. I teach a sociology of media class sometimes. And she disconnected. She just suspended her Facebook account for a semester, and the reaction from her social peers was really negative. Right? People were upset that she wasn't talking to them on Facebook, that she didn't know what was going on in their lives, because they expected that she would get news about them from monitoring their Facebook posts and from monitoring her Facebook feed. And this was a sort of super interesting phenomenon from her example. And so she tried to escape, and she did escape for a while, but there were negative consequences for doing so. People sanctioned her for trying to escape. You can go live in the woods, right? So I can give you one more way to think about this, and that is to think about different spheres of reality. If you look at this classical work in sociology and sociological theory about how knowledge is constructed, it's called The Social Construction of Reality by Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman. They talk about a concept called spheres of reality, which is the idea that that some social situations take on heightened meaning or different meaning than other social situations. It's almost like there's separate spheres of reality, right? You can be in like your religious reality that views the world one way. You can be in your political reality that views the world another way. You can be in your media reality that views the world another way. And these three realities are separate. You can also think about, and this is how I would like frame this, is that, and Berger and Luckman say this, is that they're not entirely separate, but we construct them as separate, right? So when you are playing a game, a video game, right, it's sort of the idea is that you like enter into a whole different world, that you're like, the outside world doesn't matter, that you're only focused in like the virtual world doing the things that you're doing in the game. But in reality, right, things in the game and things outside the game are related. So if you get pissed off inside of a game because somebody kills you and they weren't supposed to, right, that emotion is very real, right? You feel that emotion. And after you stop playing the game, you might still feel that emotion. So emotions are one way in which the spheres of reality are permeable, right? The boundaries setting one sphere away from another sphere are not like really solid or impenetrable. Rather, things can flow back and forth between them, and those spheres are related. I mentioned video games. There's a sort of a related concept in game studies called the magic circle. And this is the idea that like when you play a game, there's certain rules and norms that apply in the game that don't apply in real life. So if you are playing soccer and you score a goal, right, great, you can score a goal, right? There's rules that has points or something like that. But if you're not playing soccer and you kick a ball into a net, right, you're not scoring a goal, you're kicking a ball into a net. It doesn't have the same meaning, it's different, but you're doing the same thing. So this is like sort of how to think about, regarding Plato's allegory of the cave, how to think about the realities that we see and other situations in which reality may be experienced differently, ultimately there's connection between all of the spheres. There's connection between all of the circles. And I love this quote here from that book, talking about children and socialization. The child does not internalize the world of his significant others as one of many possible worlds. He internalizes it as the world, the only existent and only conceivable world. Primary socialization, that is socialization from when you're a kid, thus accomplishes what, in hindsight of course, may be seen as the most important confidence trick that society plays on the individual, to make appear as necessity what is in fact a bundle of contingencies, and thus to make meaningful the accidents of his birth. Wow, I love this quote so much. We attach meaning to things that don't have inherent meaning. Right? We all do this. This is like a normal part of being human, right? We take coincidence, contingency, happenstance, statistical probability, and talk about it as if it was meant to be. We make meaningful the accident of our birth. It doesn't mean you're an accident. It just means that you happen to have been born in a time and place. You had no control over that, right? And to some extent, I mean, your parents had control over having you, likely, but they didn't necessarily have control over their existing times and places either, right? They were similarly born into a time and a place that they had no control over. But we make meaningful these accidents, right? These circumstances. Berger and Luckman's point here is that we accept the reality of the world with which we are presented. Even if we don't see the magic circle or the spheres of reality, even if we don't see media anymore, right? It becomes normal, habitual, routine. Then we have trouble understanding it as an agent of socialization. We don't see the accident of media, right? We don't see how media are socially constructed. And this is super important, right? It sort of sums up everything I've been talking about so far. Now moving forward, I want to turn to a discussion for a few minutes of representation in media. So the argument that representation really matters, right? Because if you don't pay attention to the patterns in the media that you consume, then you tend to either simply consume that which conforms with your attitudes or belief already, and or you simply reproduce the status quo through your media consumption and production. Representation matters. I wonder if you noticed some element of representation in this PowerPoint so far. Every image that I showed you is an image of a man. You can probably find a few women, in the backgrounds of some of these pictures. But every image that I've shown you is the image of someone who appears to be masculine or appears to be a man. I have deliberately not included women in this PowerPoint, right? So I have sort of subtly put a message in here about representation. And I want to draw your attention to the fact that I am not the only person who has done this, right? That usually people do this without thinking, right? Without doing it on purpose, including or excluding certain types of people, usually excluding certain types of people from media products. And those omissions tend to reproduce dominant ideas of who matters in society or how we think about certain groups of people. So it's not just about who is being represented either, like how often people are being represented, but it's also about what they're depicted as doing, the quality of the representation. So, sorry, I'm pausing a second. There's a fly that's buzzing. You can probably hear it because it's buzzed right by the microphone, so sorry about that. But I'll give you a couple examples, a couple cases of representation, how it matters, how not thinking about representation in media simply reproduces the status quo. If you think back to the 2015 Academy Awards, the Oscars, You may remember this because there was a lot of kind of talk about the Oscars being really white, and they were, very male too. So in the 2015 Academy Awards, there were no female directors or writers. There were no Black, Indigenous, or people of color in any of the 4 acting categories. So all the 20 actors for Best Actor were white, right? All 20. Neil Patrick Harris made a quip about this when he was host. He said, "Tonight we honor Hollywood's best and whitest." Sorry, brightest. Right? Because if you look at it, it's obvious that certain people are included, that is, white actors, and everyone else is missing, right? And you know, simply by looking at TV for 5 seconds, that movies are more diverse than this. And so what this is essentially saying, what the Oscars is essentially saying, is that all the movies that were notable this year, right, the only ones that were of any note were those made by men and those who had white actors, right? It's clearly nonsense, right? But you think about like why this is, right? Why is it that the Oscars were so white in 2015? Well, some background here. 43 million people watched the Academy Awards in 2015. In 2016, the ceremony reached more than 200 countries around the globe. For nearly 90 years, the Oscars have been a celebration of filmmaking, and the message that it puts across, however unintentionally, is really hard to miss, and that is that certain voices, certain actors matter more than others. In 2016, it was the same thing, right? No people of color, no Black, no Indigenous people in any of the 4 acting categories. All 20 actors up for Best Actor were white. There has been some increased representation since then. Think about this in terms of gender. I don't know if you are familiar with the Bechdel test. This is a test that you can do, a content analysis that you can even do this, as you can do any content analysis by yourself, because content analysis is the counting of variables in media. And so you can do this. Because we have to ask like why these patterns exist. So what this is saying is that this is from a study in 2012 or 2015, 2012 or 2015, looking at Academy Award Best Picture nominees by gender. So the director's gender overwhelmingly were men. In the Best Director category, all 5 were men. The Bechdel test. The Bechdel test is a test that measures the amount of talking time that women get and sort of how women are talking. So a movie passes the test. You say a movie passes the Bechdel test, or a show passes the Bechdel test if there were 2 or more named female characters who talked to each other about something other than a man, right? So if a movie passes the Bechdel test, then yes, there were 2 or more female characters who had names who did talk to each other about something other than a man. If it fails the Bechdel test, then this criteria was not met. So if a movie fails the Bechdel test, then there were not 2 female characters in the movie with names who talked to each other about something other than a man. So you can see that in this year, almost half of the movies failed the Bechdel test, right? And of those that were nominated for Best Picture, all but 1 failed the Bechdel test. This is wild, right? Why aren't there more movies where women are having more substantive conversations about something other than a man, and where women are named and talking to each other? Well, one reason is that according to the Los Angeles Times, it did a content analysis of the Oscar voters, and you can look at updates of this. I have some, I think, on the next slide. Oscar voters these are people who vote for these movies, were 94% white and 77% male. These numbers are on par with film studio heads, who at that time, by 2015, were 94% white. So 94% of the major studio heads were white, and 100% were men. So there were no women who were heads of studios. And these are, this is a reflection of people who vote on what the best movies are. So if your voters are overwhelmingly white and male, then those are naturally the kinds of movies that they're going to vote on as being like the best movies of the year. So there's a huge diversity gap here in terms of gender and sexual orientation, in terms of racial representation as well. And this is observable throughout all sorts of media, whether you're looking at video games, television shows, primetime, films that are up for nomination for these awards. So it's not just about lack of representation in movies themselves, not just on screen and at award shows, but also in the governing bodies. So this year, the Golden Globes is like the same kind of old like controversy, the same kind of pattern that we've been seeing, over and over and over, that people have started talking about in the last several years, but that still hasn't had much done about it. So the Golden Globes is the television equivalent of the Academy Awards, right? The Hollywood Foreign Press Association is the awards body for the Golden Globes. They have not had a single black member for over 20 years, right? There are 87 members in the Hollywood Foreign Press Association, and none of them are black. So you might wonder why the vast majority of Golden Globes winners for various categories are white. Well, this is partly your answer, because you think about who produces content, not only who produces content, but who is in the governing bodies that determine what content is valuable in a society. If the people who are on those governing bodies do not represent the society, then they will present a skewed version of what is considered the best art that a society produces. The LA Times, linked above, said that the Hollywood Foreign Press Association does not publicly list its members, but some details of its workings have emerged. It includes various other kinds of people that don't, just on the face of it, don't seem to be authorities on TV or film. A Miss Universe, a Russian bodybuilder turned filmmaker, and a Finnish person who has books and DVDs on the Chinese art of face reading. So at the Golden Globes this year, members of the Hollywood Foreign Press Association came on stage to address the organization's lack of diversity and explain how it will correct its mistakes. So how will it become more diverse? And there are various, the Academy Awards folks did the same thing several years ago as well, saying they would diversify their voting body, and they largely have not done this. So we, I say we, but like, these governing bodies have to be held accountable to the promises that they make in terms of diversifying, because they have so much power, not just in the United States, but individually, right? Not individually, internationally. The American culture, Hollywood, our TV industries are like America's most powerful exports, right? We export this stuff all over the world. I've told you before, I spent 4 years living in Singapore and traveling around that part of the world. They all know American media over there. And Singapore has its own, media industry. But people watch, right, around the world, watch American media. And so when they see the same kinds of skewed representations that we see, they develop the same sorts of stereotypes about race or gender, the same kinds of ideas about who matters or what matters. And this perpetuates dominant modes of relationships and power in societies. So it's really important to think about this stuff. You can watch a fantastic documentary. I highly recommend this documentary, like so hard. It's about the Motion Picture Association of America, which I think now is just called the Motion Picture Association. I think they dropped the of America part. But that is the industry organization that rates movies, PG, PG-13, R. It's like a voluntary. It's voluntary because if the industry doesn't voluntarily rate their own movies, then the government will do it. And so you see this with a lot of industries where they will, set up an organization to regulate themselves because their regulations will be more lax and probably more intrusive. More lax and less intrusive than if the government regulated them. And so they do this to avoid government regulation. But you might wonder, why movies are rated the way that they are. Well, that kind of thing, until really recently, and even still, it's really not common knowledge. Like, it's really not publicly available. You really have to dig into it. And there's a documentary in 2006 that did some of this digging and really shook up the Motion Picture Association of America. It is called "This Film Is Not Yet Rated." I highly recommend this movie. Among what it found, essentially it tried to figure out who actually was on the board of the Motion Picture Association of America, like who actually votes to rate the movies the way that they're rated. Because there's lots of weird contradictions in the ratings. For example, like you're given like one F-bomb. If you do like more than one F-bomb, it's automatically rated R. The stuff about like you can show all sorts of violence, but if you show like one penis, it's rated R, like, but you can show a ton of violence and it's only PG-13, and like cartoon violence is okay. There's all sorts of just like weird, sort of like, why is it like this but not like this? Anyway, in this movie, the documentary filmmakers they pick up leads and they would follow people around in Hollywood and sort of like try and figure out who these people were, like sort of like subtly attending meetings or gatherings of these raiders, following them to their houses, like spying on them. It's really interesting, sort of like detective work. But they figured out who a lot of these people were. And there are clear patterns in who these people were. And I bet you can figure out and you can assume what kinds of people these were. They were largely middle-aged. They were almost exclusively white. They were largely conservative, which is really interesting to think about how we rate media in terms of morality. They largely were conservative. And very few of them had children, right? And you think about why you would want to rate movies or rate music, and largely it's because you want things to be safe for children to watch. And most of these people didn't even have kids. So it was not really a good representation. And this really shook up the industry a bit. But let's see, what else did they find here? I'm quoting. The board's raters receive no training and are deliberately chosen because of their lack of expertise in media literacy or child development, right? So they actually didn't want experts on media literacy and they didn't want experts on child development. They chose people who actually didn't know anything about this stuff to rate your movies. Yeah, so it's super interesting stuff. But this is still really important, right? The causes and effects of media representation really, really, really matter. There's another recent example of Love Island, South Africa, that I saw, and I thought this was really silly. South Africa's population is mostly black, right? I think it's about 80% black African. Well, in Love Island, South Africa, for the season, there were 3 out of 10? 3 out of 10 were black, so 30% were black. It was a huge misrepresentation of the population of South Africa. It makes you think about who reality TV shows are for, who this entertainment is for. It's not just about audience, but it's reality TV, right? It's about who can be in relationships. Think about The Bachelor, the same sort of thing, right? The Bachelor is one of the most watched shows for over a decade in the United States. Maybe this started 2 decades ago. But it is a show about falling in love. It is a show about relationships, and it is hugely, hugely skewed toward wealthier, sort of typical white Americans, right? There's actually a class action discrimination lawsuit brought against The Bachelor in 2012 for excluding people of color, as there had not been one black person on the show for 4 seasons before that. Now, of course, there are a couple, and there's a really interesting sort of reckoning almost that The Bachelor had with race, where the Bachelor right now, or the recent one, was a black man, and he picked a white woman. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff that goes on behind the Bachelor scenes, right? Their choices are not really choices. It's a very staged show, and you can read all sorts of exposés and stuff about it. But that The Bachelor historically ignores race altogether is ignoring a part of reality about how people get together, right? People tend to choose mates, choose partners based on race, social class, based on similarities, cultural similarities and ethnic similarities and social class similarities. And The Bachelor totally ignores all of that as if it doesn't matter. It really does matter. And we can't address these issues unless we can have open conversations about this stuff. And so this last season of The Bachelor was interesting because there was a sort of a tell-all where there was some open conversation about this. But if we don't talk about it, we risk perpetuating and reproducing status quo stuff. You can think about video games as another example, and I'll give you just this last bit here. Looking at some of my research as well that I've done into representations of women in video game advertisements. But gaming of all kinds is traditionally a masculine hobby, right? Traditionally for men. You think about the origins of video games lie in old war games and tabletop games, moving into the role-playing games of the 1970s and 1980s, like Dungeons and Dragons, and then you get into video games, over the course of the evolution of those as we get to today. But there have always been women video game players, right? This study from 1982 on arcade game players found that about a fifth of players in arcades were women. An old study from Nintendo in 1987 found that about a quarter of Nintendo players were women. Although you would not think about that if you just look at representations of who we think consumers of games are. Of course, this is changing now. The representations are more accurate, but there have always been a large number of women in games and gaming, but they have not been represented at all. They've been omitted, or if women have been in games, like historically, it's been a lot of like really overt hypersexualization. And you can look at like box art of video games from like the 1980s and 1990s. Women were almost always damsels in distress, were very rarely heroes. And if they were really highly sexualized, like Lara Croft in Tomb Raider, for example. But here's some really good examples of literature, of content analyses, of representation of women in video games. Female characters at low resolutions, that is, when they were like in the backgrounds, were systematically larger than average American women, while female characters at higher resolutions were systematically thinner. Right? So this is really interesting. So when women were shown more prominently in video games, they tended to conform with traditional American beauty norms, being thinner. When women were relegated to the background in scenes and stuff, that's when they would be more likely to be shown as bigger, as like less conforming to traditional norms of beauty in American society. Female characters more significantly shown to be nude, unrealistic body images, etc., etc. Video game sales are positively correlated with sexualization of non-central female characters on box art, right? So the more the box art has sexualized female characters who are not the main characters, the more likely that game is to sell, which is fascinating. And this may be less relevant today because there's not really box art much anymore. I mean, there is, you can still buy games in the store, but now we look at digital advertisements, which is what I've done some research on as well. Let's see, what was another interesting one? Yeah, so you think about producers, right? There's huge overrepresentation of white men, and Asian men as well, but men especially in video game development production teams. So this tends to affect how representation happens in the games that they're making. Large overrepresentations of white males, wild males, of white males in games, and underrepresentations of everyone else, or misrepresentations of everyone else. You can find plenty of examples to the contrary, but these are the overall patterns, right? I just wanted to point out, though, as I mentioned, like things have been changing, and this is good. In the 2010s, you saw a significant uptick in more positive depictions of women as heroes, as main characters, as strong characters, and crucially, while being all these things, also as less sexualized characters. This is partly the result of more women entering the hobby. Like, it's like half and half almost now. In most major surveys of people who play games, about half men, half women. Some genres are really still male dominated, others are women dominated. There are more women entering the game industry, and the same thing goes for people of color as well than ever before. Like, these pipelines have to be created, right? When we think about why production teams traditionally look the way they do, we think about who can enter the profession, right? Who can go to school for this kind of stuff? Like, who is encouraged or who is discouraged from going to school to learn how to design games? I'm a co-advisor for the game development club at GDC, and it's like almost all dudes. I mean, but there are women in the club, but we try to like really encourage women to come and feel comfortable and, you know, to like enjoy games and to learn how to make them and to learn all the technical skills. Because without that encouragement, many women will, you know, come to the meetings and they'll see it's a bunch of guys and they'll say, you got to make people feel included when they're not represented. If you don't do that work, then you perpetuate the same kind of representation. There's also a variety in kinds of games and genres of games with the sort of like rise of indie development in the last decade or so. And so you get lots of games that are not just about killing people, which is sort of the traditional sort of type of video game, which is all about you just kill stuff. But you have games about empathy and games about loss and games about depression and games about dealing with an alcoholic father and games about, you know, all sorts of other stuff. Sometimes women are still trapped in gender roles in even these better representations of video games. For example, the reboots of Tomb Raider. There's a story about the opening scenes of the 2013 game, the reboot, where Lara Croft's motive, and it was shown in an early trailer, and people reacted kind of negatively to it. Her motive essentially was being the victim of sexual violence, and a lot of people were like, why do you have to make Lara Croft's motive the victim of sexual violence? Like, we understand she's like, she's strong and she's a badass and she fights through all this pain and all this stuff is like really positive, but like, does she have to be a victim in the first place? Like, can you just make her a badass? Like, come up with some other reason for like why she's doing this, because you wouldn't make like a story about a man be, because he was sexually assaulted. Like, the man would just be, have some other reason. He'd be badass for whatever other reason. So, okay, you can think about women, but now think about race, think about disability status, think about other cultures being represented. I can talk to you endlessly about this stuff, but my point here is that representation matters. If you don't pay attention to it, then media producers will reproduce, and people who consume media, if you're not paying attention to what you're consuming, you will just you'll tend to consume the same kind of thing. You will reproduce the status quo. This is what has happened for generations and generations and generations. We want to be very specific about being more inclusive and telling more diverse stories in our media. You can think about this in terms of the theoretical perspectives we've been talking about today, reinforcement theory, agenda setting theory. You can think about how news media might operate against some of your favorite pastimes, right? How I talked about media can create moral panic, like news can create moral panic. One really great example of moral panic in media is the video games and violence phenomenon, right? This is a huge moral panic, not so much anymore. It is still there, but it was much more heightened a decade or two ago, where people were really concerned that, video games are making people violent. This was largely a result of the Columbine shootings in 1999, where it was revealed that the shooters at Columbine liked to play Doom, right? A gory, violent, satanic first-person shooter game. Therefore, video games made people violent and led to boys being like interested in the occult and satanic stuff. And so there was a huge backlash against video games around the late 90s and early 2000s and mid 2000s because people thought that they contributed to mass shootings and stuff like that. There's been a lot of research in this. They don't. There's really, 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 really scant evidence and very, 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 very little connection between video games and violence. There's a ton of research on this. I'm happy to point it out to you. The stuff that does find relationship is usually psychological studies, and they usually show some mild heightened aggression after playing what are termed violent games, and that usually dissipates after a very short amount of time. And these have always also been conducted in laboratory settings, and there's problems with that. Anyway, I can also talk to you about that on and on and on. Another example of moral panics, the news media, sort of pointing out issues with some of the hobbies that people liked, was the satanic panic around Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop gaming and fantasy gaming in the 70s and 80s. The same thing happened with Harry Potter in the 2000s, where people were coming out against Harry Potter. This is actually one of the most requested banned books of all time, the Harry Potter books, claiming that it introduces children to the occult and therefore should be banned. So think about agenda setting theory, right? How news outlets can promote ideas about, how certain media forms or franchises are good or bad, and people will then tend to think about them in the terms of the narratives that they hear on news media. So be active in seeking out other media sources for news. Try new games, listen to new music, and attempt to find meaning in those things. Of course, like what you like, but question why you like it, right? Why do you like the stuff you like? Why do you dislike other stuff? Think about how people are represented in the stuff that you like. Think about who's omitted, how people are represented, and how it represents reality to you. And it's a good self-reflection. It's a good reflection to have. And I will leave you with that. If you have remembered to tally your notifications, then I would be very interested to see them. and I will add them to my data set. This is my data set so far. You can see. Don't let this change what you send me. I'll add your data to my data set, and I'll update you all with it. So that is what I have on media and media life. I hope you enjoyed this. Like I said, I teach an entire class on this stuff, and I could go on and on and on and on about any single thing in here. Feel free to email me. Feel free to bring it up to me. Have a great week. Thank you very much.